right. All right, good evening, good afternoon. My name is Dr. David Canton, and I'm the director of the African American Studies program, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'd like to thank the Department of History, the UF Office of Black Student Engagement, and the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies for co-sponsoring the event. Last summer, our program received a $100,000 Mellon grant, and we created a Mellon African American Studies Scholars Program. Our grant has funded our Mellon Scholar Speaker Series. In January, we invited Dr. Jeffrey Oakbar from the University of Connecticut, and last month we invited Dr. Donna Ayin Davis from Queens College. This year, we selected 4 African American Studies majors who presented a paper at the National Council for Black Studies Conference in San Jose, California. Will our Mellon scholars please stand up? Give them a hand, one round of applause. They did an excellent job, and we had a great time up there in San Jose, and we're doing this again next year. If you're African Studies majors or minors, looking into apply for the Mellon Scholars. Outside of that, we have, this past year, we have embarked on a number of different initiatives. We have Dr. Rashay Barnes putting together our UF Ghana program trip for summer 2025. So again, we are doing big things on this campus. So Dr. Rashay Barnes, Associate Professor of African Studies and Anthropology, will introduce our speaker for this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Canton. So I'm extremely excited to introduce one of my sister scholar friends and colleagues, Dr. Tanisha C. Ford. Dr. Ford is a foremost voice speaking on the intersection of politics, economics, and culture. She makes connections between the past and the present in ways that shed new light on today's most pressing social issues. She is a professor of history and biography and memoir at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. She's written 4 books: Our Secret Society, Molly Moon, and the Glamour, Money, and Power Behind the Civil Rights Movement, which was published by Amistad HarperCollins in fall 2023, and just won the NAACP Image Award. Can we get that? Like just this past weekend. So we're really excited to be the first on her stop after the award. Dressed in Dreams is also one of her publications. It's a Black girl's love letter to the power of fashion, published by St. Martin's in June 2019. Kwame Braithwaite, Black is Beautiful, and the award-winning Liberated Threads, Black Women's Style and the Global Politics of Soul, published by UNC Press in 2015. She is currently working on a genre-bending book about sculptor and institution builder Augusta Savage for Penguin Press's Signification series. Dr. Ford has received several major awards and honors. She was named one of the Roots 100 Most Influential African Americans. Her research has been supported by prestigious institutions such as New America, Emerson Collective, the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, in addition to being a part of our program, the Ford Foundation, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and London University School of Advanced Study, among many others. Dr. Ford writes regularly for newspapers and magazines. Her analysis and cultural commentary have been featured in diverse outlets, including the New York Times, The Atlantic, Time, Elle, Town and Country, Harper's Bazaar, The Root, Aperture, CBS News, WNYC, and NPR. Dr. Ford is a dynamic speaker and engages with national and international audiences about the cost of racial justice movements, the history of Black mutual aid networks, philanthropy and the civil rights movement, the Black Midwest, and the geopolitics of the fashion and beauty industries. She also conducts workshops on life writing, which includes memoir, biography, and autobiography, and strategies for developing anti-racist philanthropic practices. She's a native of Indiana and currently resides in Harlem. And to learn more, I invite you to visit her website, which she has listed there on her slides. And without further ado, welcome her to the podium to talk with you about her topic for today. What a pleasure. Thank you for
introduction. Thank you for inviting me to spend time here on campus. You know, I honestly think that this might be my first time in Florida. No. My first time giving a talk at a university in Florida, let me clarify. And it's really what a moment to be here. As historians, we reach back into the past, collecting different artifacts to piece together historical moments. But the challenge often I find in doing that work is we're studying these things from the past that have so many resonances in the present. So I was working on my last book, Our Secret Society. I started writing this book in 2020 as we saw our world really spiral into the COVID-19 pandemic, and we saw the police murder of George Floyd, and all this white guilt giving to Black organizations, Black Lives Matter organizations, or at least pledging to give this money. And I'm writing this book that's dealing with the 1950s and 60s, but everything seems so ever present. And just on the other side of all of those promises and declarations about anti-racism and anti-sexism, we see these virulent attacks on DEI, on Black intellectualism. We see a retrenchment in those resources by the same moneyed elites that had just promised that money a few years ago. And I don't have to tell you all, you know, you live here, that this is a hotbed for these types of debates and conversations about the role of Black studies in this time. So really it's an honor to be here to add my work to the conversation and to give you all something think about. I know many of you are researchers of your own work, pursuing your own research topics, and maybe something I can say here today will spark or fuel an idea for you as well. So again, I'd like to extend my thank yous to the African American Studies program, the Mellon Foundation, the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, the Department of History, and the Office of Black Student Engagement for inviting me, and to Drs. Barnes and Canton for being such amazing hosts since I've been here. So we're just gonna have some real talk, right? I have these slides and we'll go through them and all that, but I really just want to talk to you and break some things down. As I mentioned, I just finished working on this book. It was published in October, Our Secret Society. It centers on this woman named Molly Moon. Has anybody ever heard of her? More than likely not. A lot of people hadn't. I hadn't heard of her. I was actually working on my dissertation when I first stumbled upon her in the archive. And at the time, I was looking for someone else, didn't even know Molly Moon existed, but was intrigued by the fact that she was a Black woman named Molly. Now, this is before Issa Rae's show Insecure, so, you know, I was like, oh, Black Molly. And I realized she was this glamorous woman who hosted all these events in Harlem for Black folks, celebrating Black women's beauty. And at the time, I was working on a dissertation that was taking up that conversation. And so I thought, I'm going to write a book about Molly Moon. Now, it took me a minute to get back to her. I wrote a couple of other books in the process, but she became this amazing figure in my work. It was far more than just this fantastic, glamorous socialite. She actually was a key to the money and how the money moves across movements. And it got me thinking about how little I knew as someone who studies the civil rights movement about just how the money was raised to fund voter registration drives, marches like the March on Washington, after school programs, breakfast programs for Black youth, sit-ins, freedom rides. All those things cost money. And as I began to dig around Molly Moon's archive, is my battery going low? As I began to dig around in her archive, I realized that everything she did was a fundraiser. The events she hosted, so here on the slide, which these are images that I've captured from the archival documents that I collected, you can see one here where it says she's raised $10,000 for the Urban League through her National Urban League Guild, which is a body that she founded. I'll speak about that in a little bit more detail later. But in trying to find Molly Moon and to piece together her life, I encountered all these other archival materials. I did a deep dive into the financial records of the National Urban League, and so you can see their bank ledgers and financial statements. I also went through Molly Moon's own personal papers, found letters and correspondence, including this one here in the middle that is from the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, the former King of England. His secretary writing back to Molly Moon saying, unfortunately, we can't be guest judges at one of your costumed affairs. The royals will be out of the country, but just the fact that this Black woman had this kind of reach. So I was able to figure out the parameters of her social network. Old magazines and newspaper clippings, and also menus. Like, you have all these lavish parties. Okay, what are you feeding folk? You know, we were just talking about food earlier and how important food is in terms of building community and kinship. So I was able to collect all of these documents as well. But before Molly Moon became a major fundraiser for the Civil Rights Movement, she was a college student like y'all. This is a picture of her from roughly 1925, 1926, when she was a student at Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee, where she earned a degree in pharmacy. You can see the Marcel waves and the finger waves and the little tendrils, the baby hairs. The baby hairs is baby hair in this photo. Very 1920s aesthetic. She did not come from a wealthy family. She was born into a very working class family in Hattiesburg, Mississippi in 1907, which seems like a really long time ago. But what I realized that we could use that language of she was before her time, and that she was not a conventional woman who adhered to conventional traditions. And in the book, I talk about her 3 marriages. The first of which was a marriage to one of her college professors. I'm not telling anybody in this room to do that, but she married one of her professors. They moved off to New Orleans, where he was from, opened a pharmacy, and she realized that she could not fit into Black bourgeois society in New Orleans. And after that, marriage blows up in the biggest scandal that was flashed all across the Black newspapers. She left New Orleans and relocated to Harlem, where she formed a community with leading Black intellectuals and artists of the day. So this is a photograph of Molly Moon, who is seated in the chair to my left, my far left. She's there in the chair. In front of her is her good friend Dorothy West, who was a Harlem Renaissance era writer. Louise Thompson Patterson, Louise Thompson at that time, this is before she's married. She's seated on the floor across from Dorothy West, and then behind Dorothy West is a woman named Neil Jones, who was a Black lesbian artist who graduated from Hampton. Also in this photograph, you can see Langston Hughes. Molly's future 3rd husband is in the back row. His homies is back there. Like, it really was a group of people who became major voices in the New Negro movement, but also in the Civil Rights movement as the movement accelerated over time. This photograph was taken on a ship as they crossed the Atlantic to travel to Russia to make a film, a racial propaganda film about labor exploitation across the US South. And these were young people. Some of them were even college students. Mill had just graduated from Hampton, another gentleman here in the picture had just graduated from Howard. And this was, for many of them, their first time abroad, and they were trying to find ways to combat capitalism and labor exploitation in the United States. So they were looking to form this comradeship with folks, the proletariat in the USSR. So I was able to piece together Molly's own politics using photographs like this and her time living abroad in Moscow to understand something about her radicalism. Shortly after that trip, she marries Henry Lee Moon, who, as I mentioned, was also on that trip to Moscow. He was a leading Black public intellectual. You could think of him as like a Ta-Nehisi Coates of sorts of his time, who wrote about lynching in America, the housing crisis, and other issues that were salient topics for African Americans. So they were a young, power couple, if you will, who had a deep commitment to politics and to racial equality, which at that time, in the late 1930s and early 40s, being advocates for an anti-capitalist movement, being proponents of racial equality, having traveled to the USSR, believing in the power of grassroots networks, all of those things made them, deemed them radicals, especially in the eyes of the US government, which became a very fraught issue as both of them got jobs working for the US government in various capacities. So this just gives you a sense of like who Molly Moon was, what her politics were. They were deeply informed by Marxism, and also Pan-Africanism, Black internationalism. She, unlike Henry, she saw the potential in socialism and communism as a path forward, a way to combat capitalism. There you go. And part of her community, again, was this established set of Black artists. These are people who are part of the Harlem Artists Guild, who were in many ways trying to change the representation of African Americans in the arts. They were pioneers in that regard. Augusta Savage is in the middle with, almost directly in the middle, wearing a dress. She was the founder of the Harlem Community Arts Center. And this center was a very important space in the Harlem community in the late 30s and early 40s that received some funding from the US government. But what they quickly realized was that that funding was not enough to maintain this art center, which was a major creative hub for everyday Black youth and Black adults alike, who could be taught by the leading voices and figures in Black arts of the day. So it's kind of like if you could go down the street and take a class with Hindi Wali or Amy Sherald or Jatavia Gary. It was just really an epicenter of Black artistic production. So they wanted to keep these doors open, and like many of the other people on that Moscow trip, it was very much left-leaning, which meant that they often ran into conflict with the US government over the funding too. So Molly Moon is brought in to be a fundraiser for this community art center, to save this art center. So she launches this signature fundraising event, the Beaux-Arts Ball, which is a costumed affair that borrows from West Indian traditions of carnival and also Black queer ballroom traditions. Drag balls were very common in Harlem in the 1920s and 30s. So this became one of her signature events. Now, kind of like the present day moment, African Americans were facing a series of crises around funding. So when you think about the civil rights movement today, or the racial justice movement today, and we saw in 2020, how many people saw the coverage about BLM and receiving $90 million and the controversy about that? A little. So a similar dynamic was happening in the late 1940s and early 50s, wherein the movement is starting to accelerate. African Americans' calls for racial equality were reaching fever pitch, especially as Black soldiers came home from World War II. You have a rising Black middle class, and the racial wealth gap and poverty is expanding among African Americans as well. So we need racial justice, and we need it now. The National Urban League, which was one of the major civil rights organizations, has this, what they think is a bright idea to engage these moneyed elites on the East Coast in New York City. So they create this strategy where they recruit people like Winthrop Rockefeller and the Vanderbilts and the Javitzes and all these extremely wealthy white folks to be a part of this movement. Now the problem is they don't tell everyday Black folk about this, that they're getting this money from these wealthy white elites. But the Black folks aren't stupid, nor is the Black press. They can see you're having all of these high-end fancy events that we're not invited to. the real victims of lynching, their families aren't invited to these events. You seem to be catering to white folks, but when you want to have these everyday capital campaign drives, National Urban League and NAACP, then you're running to the Black community for our small dollar donations. So there was real tension then, just like we see now, about where should we be getting money to fund our movements. Is it really justice if the money to back these movements comes from major philanthropic foundations, corporations, and so forth? So in the book, what I really do is map out this political discourse around money and fundraising and the role that women like Molly Moon played in this. So you see, this is Molly Moon seated next to Winthrop Rockefeller during one of the National Urban League's major fundraisers. Women often became the face of this fundraising work because it was deemed feminized labor. So Molly Moon was often charged with carrying out these initiatives that the male leadership had enacted. So we can see her here with Jean Vanderbilt and Flora Cowles, who was married into a media empire. But these are extremely wealthy white women that Molly Moon is now having to work alongside to raise money because the male leadership of the National Urban League says our strategy is going to be to take money from these people. But again, doing it in secret for the most part. And telling the Black press, oh, well, yes, we have white people who are members of our organization, but they're not controlling our organization. I found in my research that in fact was not true and would really become an even bigger lie once we get on the other side of the Brown v. Board of Education decision. So before I go there, I want to fill in a gap. Well, actually, no, I will go there and I'll come back to this photograph. So, you all are familiar with the Brown v. Board of Education decision, are you? Okay, so what did it do? Go ahead.
It desegregated the schools and took separate and equal out of the vernacular of laws.
Look at that! You go to law school? Love the way you explain that.
No, but I know my history.
Yes! I love that. Do we have history majors in the room, by the way? What are y'all majors? What y'all studying?
I'm an engineer.
Hmm?
Engineer.
Engineer, okay. Biology, okay. So we have some scientists in the room, okay. Look at this, so, yes, legally it says separate is inherently unequal. But then the fight became, how are we going to then implement this law? Make it de facto the law of the land. So de jure, we have this win, this victory in the courts, but how do we make this the everyday reality for Black people in the United States? That proved to be a much tougher journey. Now, what you can see here are some documents I found in the Rockefeller Archives Center, and my mind was really blown by these documents. Okay, so I just told you how the movement for racial equality has accelerated on the other side of World War II, so in the late 1940s, early 50s. At this same time, the National Urban League and the NAACP, the two major civil rights organizations of that era, are advocating for the wealthy white elite to join in the struggle, because if we can get their money, their support, then we can advance the movement, right? That's their ideology at the time. Brown v. Board decision is a major court victory for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And one of the people who was in that photo that I showed you from Moscow, Lauren Miller, he was actually on that legal team, working alongside Thurgood Marshall. So again, Molly Moon, from her 20s, from your age, she was in league with the people who would make these major civil rights strides over the course of the 20th century. Okay, so that just sets the stage here. How many people have heard of white citizens' councils? Okay, sweet. Okay, listen, the professors in the room were like me. So these white citizens councils are really important. They emerge on the other side of the Brown v. Board decision. How many people have heard of the Ku Klux Klan? Almost everyone, all of us have, right? So we know about the vigilante violence. We know about the physical violence against Black people, this anti-Black violence. But there's also this economic anti-Black violence that's enacted by these white citizens councils, which comprised doctors, lawyers, bank presidents, university presidents, people who could, insurance agents who could issue you a home loan or deny you a home loan or a car loan. So the White Citizens Council saw themselves as the genteel arm of racism, right, of segregationists. So you have this 1-2 punch of the Klan with their actual physical violence, bombing churches, homes, running civil rights leaders out of town, if not murdering them altogether. And then you have the second punch of the white citizens councils who are enacting these economic reprisals, where they're saying, okay, if we believe you have a connection to this burgeoning civil rights movement in any kind of way, we'll get you kicked out of school. Because you go to a state-funded school and you think you're an activist, oh, you're gonna get booted out of the school. Even state-funded HBCUs. Right? So just imagine if people were going to FAMU and saying, okay, you're involved in the movement, you're out, all right? And because we think you're involved in the movement, we're gonna make sure your parents lose their home. If you are a teacher that's employed by the state, you can lose your pension if we think you have any connection to this movement, okay? So this economic violence was intense on the other side of Brown v. Board. What these documents here are forms, letters that are being written to major philanthropic organizations that are discussing the fact that the National Urban League has been kicked out of the community chest. Now, the community chest is more than a set of cards on a Monopoly game board, right? The community chest is a local pool of money that any of you could put your money into and it could support local organizations that you as a community care about. Well, they were booting them out of the community chest because the white citizens councils were strong-arming the community chest to boot out the National Urban League and the NAACP chapters. So this creates a financial crisis. Now, when we discuss the history of the civil rights movement, oftentimes what states come to mind when we talk about the civil rights movement?
Deep South.
Okay, so Deep South, so name states, go ahead. Alabama, for sure. Georgia. Florida, right, but I feel like Florida doesn't get the play that it should in the national conversation about civil rights, right? Like, we think about Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, but Jacksonville, Florida was a major hub of civil rights activity. And you all know this geography better than I do, so you can think about where Jacksonville sits in relation to Tallahassee, to Gainesville, to the southern parts of Georgia. It was a major center for civil rights activism. It had a very active and very radical NAACP chapter, for example. So when you start booting Jacksonville out, which these documents talk about Jacksonville, Little Rock, Arkansas, New Orleans, Louisiana, these places that we often don't center in that civil rights Southern narrative, they were in a financial crisis. And some leaders, in fact, from Broward County, Florida, were assassinated. Their home was firebombed. They were killed. They died. One died instantly. One died on the way to the hospital because the hospitals were still, at this time, legally segregated. So they had to drive the male leader 20 miles away to the black hospital, right? So he dies in the way. So this was I'm trying to paint a picture here for you where money is necessary to sustain the fight for social justice, but the black community is being strangled in terms of the money that it has at its disposal. And it's not just this vigilante violence that we often talk about, it's this violence that is enacted by these white citizens councils that is, in essence, greenlit by politicians, okay? So we can see this, the political economy of how local dollars are blended with the big dollar donations that the extremely wealthy in a given city have access to, and the influence they have over local and state politics, okay? And even national politics. So this is a situation that that activists are encountering on the other side of Brown v. Board. So when the National Urban League, for example, says, okay, well, we need to start taking money from these rich elites in New York City, who we think are more, racial liberals, even though that term, that's a problematic political position anyway. They're doing so because these organizations are in dire financial straits. And if you know anything about the NAACP and the Urban League, it's usually the local chapters that have a more radical political agenda. So the more grassroots-oriented chapters of these organizations have no money, their leaders have been ran out of town, some of their leaders have been assassinated. So what then happens is civil rights organizations like the National Urban League are having to offer loans to bail out these local affiliates. Okay, so think about this. It's just like you would apply for a bank loan to cover something. Maybe you want a new Xbox. I don't know. Whatever young people are doing with money these days, right? You're wanting a loan. You're applying for that loan. But how are you going to repay the loan? Especially in this case where the stakes are so high that when is the financial picture ever going to look up for your local chapter? Okay, so they have to issue these loans. They're sending the national headquarters into debt. So now the national headquarters are in debt. They need these wealthy, or at least in their minds, they need these wealthy philanthropists and corporate titans to essentially bail them out, to get them back in the black, right? But this creates a long-term dependency where now we have a grant funding relationship where, just like you might apply to Mellon for money to support student-led initiatives, which we can get behind that makes sense to us, but we've now created a situation in the 1950s where local chapters are having to apply to the equivalent of the Mellon Foundation of that day to say, we need to stop the anti-black violence and the economic reprisals in our city. Can you give us X amount of thousands of dollars, right? So that is part of the cost of racial justice. You now have to apply for funding to support the movement, just like you or I would apply for a small research grant. But this is to create racial equality for everyday black folk. Just so you have the right to vote, so you have the right to live, so your kids can go to a decent school. You have to apply for funding just to support this kind of justice initiative. And it's this funding structure that still exists today, where people are writing to these major philanthropic foundations to fund the fight for racial justice. We can talk about this during Q&A to see what you all think about this as a structure. So I want to go back here to this woman, Georgia Gilmore. Most of you are probably not familiar with her. Georgia Gilmore, anybody familiar? Okay. She was a black woman. So we have Molly Moon, who I talked about earlier, who was, an educated black woman from a working class black family, who ascends to, the ranks of New York Black society. She's fundraising alongside the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and all of these moneyed elites. At the same time, this situation across the South, as I mentioned, is becoming all the more dire. And it's from this moment that we get a large-scale boycott like the Montgomery bus boycott. Are you all familiar with the bus boycott? Dr. King and all that? Okay, great. So we know Dr. King. We know Rosa Parks. Some people now are even starting to know Claudette Colvin's name. Well, this is Georgia Gilmore, and I want you to know her name because she is a central fundraiser in the Montgomery Improvement Association. She's not the big face, big name like Dr. King, who of course becomes famous on the other side of, famous and infamous, on the other side of this bus boycott. But she is a domestic laborer and a talented cook who creates this club from nowhere, a group of anonymous cooks who raise money for the bus boycott by selling chicken and pork chop dinners. And this is really significant because a lot of us who grew up in the church, if you grew up in the church, one thing you know about the church is there was always a building fund. All right, you're always trying to get the church a new building, a new roof. And oftentimes it was those chicken dinners that helped to fund that building fund. So this is Black women using the tools and ingenuity at their disposal to raise money for a church in the instance I just mentioned, but in this case for a large scale bus boycott that lasts over a year, where Black people are finding, or they're creating an alternative transportation system. And it's Georgia Gilmore and her club from nowhere is raising all of this money to support. So on the one hand, we have Northern activists and the national headquarters of these civil rights organizations making pleas to the financial elite of the North and trying to funnel money down from them to the South. On the other hand, we have an increasing number of grassroots organizations with fundraising initiatives that are led by women like Georgia Gilmore, who are trying to raise money to combat Jim Crow segregation in their cities and to agitate for integration in public services. So I really want to make sure you all know the name Georgia Gilmore. I'm just trying to create this network of Black women activists who are major fundraisers in this moment. So another thing that happens on the other side of Brown v. Board, of course, we have a sit-ins movement that starts in the early 1960s, and in the book I trace some of these, early sit-ins, moving the conversation beyond South Carolina, the Carolinas, and college campuses to think about places like Oklahoma City to really show like the map and range of direct nonviolent action. But the leaders of these civil rights organizations, like Dr. King, Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, at this point Dr. King has started the SCLC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Congress of Racial Equality, the National Urban League, they are battling over money, over resources, because again, the need is so great. To fund this movement, these direct actions, to create bail campaigns. Bail campaigns cost money. If you're an activist and you get arrested and now we have to bail you out, where is that money going to come from, right? So these people who at some point they come to be known as the Big Six leaders, they're trying to agitate for change in the White House and in the legislature, right? So they're trying to appeal to JFK to get him to pass a civil rights bill. So you can see all these males in the room. A. Philip Randolph's in this picture as well. So because there's this war over the money, and I'm saying war, which is inaccurate, but only mildly, because it really was a deep issue. There was a financial crisis, and you have all these different civil rights organizations, and they are battling over the money, because now everybody's trying to get money from the philanthropic elite, the corporate elite. They decide to come together under the banner of the civil rights leadership, CUCRL. And Whitney Young becomes the leader of the CUCRL. He is, at this point, the head of the National Urban League. Okay, Council for United Civil Rights Leadership. I have to remember the acronym here. Now, one of the main voices speaking out against the CUCRL in this project of taking white money for the movement is this person right here. Who's this?
Malcolm X.
Did somebody say Barack Obama? Okay. Malcolm X, yes. So Malcolm X is speaking out against the CUCRL, okay? In one of his most famous speeches, Message to the Grassroots, he talks about this. So I want to play this clip from the speech, because this is an overlooked part of the speech. We often talk about the field Negro, the house Negro part of the speech, but he talks about this financial crisis. Do I have sound here? Okay, let's see. Is it gonna play my video? Okay, so I won't play the video. Oh, maybe that's why I'm not on the Wi-Fi. Oh, but I think I am. Okay, well, if I can't get it to play, I'll just tell you what he says. Man, I wanted you to hear him because Malcolm X is just one of the greatest orators ever and political theorists ever. So to hear it in his own voice, I can't give it the justice that hearing him say it would give. But essentially, he talks about how the big six civil rights leaders who have come together under this banner of the CUCRL have stolen this movement from the grassroots. That there were grassroots leaders who were positioned to take this movement in all sorts of radical directions, but because they were hungry for the money and the recognition, they sold the movement out. And he talks in this speech about how they gathered at the Carlisle Hotel in New York City, a hotel that was considered the White House of New York City because JFK had a residence there and often did business there. So the CUCRL meet in this space along with a gentleman named Stephen Currier, who is the head of the Taconic Foundation, who sees himself as a good racial liberal, who has tons of money at his disposal. And he decides to give them $1.5 million in 1962 dollars, right? So today, that's over $3 million to fund this March on Washington. The stipulation, though, is that the more radical vision for a march that the young people who are part of SNCC and CORE and other more radical chapters of the NAACP and the Urban League, they have to move this thing completely away from that radical vision. And so he says it becomes a farce on Washington, a circus, and that you all, black folk, have allowed these big six leaders to steal the movement just like they were Jesse James and a band of bandits, right? And so it's this political debate over the money. We see this playing out today, and political scientist Megan Francis gives us the language of movement capture to discuss this. Like, what does it mean to take money from, again, these powerful elites? Will it steer the movement in a direction that moves it away from the causes that matter most to movement organizers, to the people who are on the margins of the margins? So I would definitely encourage you to go back to the speech that Malcolm X gives just mere months after the March on Washington, where he's breaking all of this down. Now, for me, as a person who grew up, loving Malcolm X, reading his speeches and all of these things, wanting to be, a member of the Nation of Islam and everything, especially after the Malcolm X biopic came out, I was just like, wow, okay, I'm listening to this speech, but also I'm in the archives and I'm seeing, no, he's exactly right. The only thing in my estimate that he gets wrong is that he says that the Kennedys own the Carlisle. They don't technically own it, but the dollar figures, everything are exactly what's being reported in the press. But no one's paying attention to this. No one is really calling attention to the fact that by this point, the bulk of the funding for this movement and this large-scale events are coming from these moneyed elites and also from a rising black celebrity class of philanthropists. So we can think about people like Harry Belafonte, who is giving money to SNCC, for example, but even that money he's procuring from other wealthy white folks that he knows. And he's also in conversations with JFK, and JFK is trying to get him to get SNCC to kind of steer more toward voter registration issues and less away from these sit-ins and more radical, direct nonviolent actions. So this is a moment of real political tension in the black community. But again, it's black women, despite all of these things that are going on, the debates that the men are having, and so on and so forth, who are often charged with doing the volunteer labor. So this is a photograph of black women at the March on Washington who are selling March programs, souvenir booklets as fundraisers, for example. So in the book, I tried to hold in tension these big picture philanthropic foundation world debates and clashes with the Black community over money. I try to hold those things in tension with the very successful, small but yet smaller campaigns around mutual aid principles that Black people are enacting in their own communities. So part of what Malcolm X is saying is that there is an alternative. It does not have to look this way. We have our own Black radical organizing tradition that doesn't rely upon this big money. And that there is a global, that we should see ourselves as part of a global movement of Black and brown people who are fighting for a revolution, right? That it's not enough just to create these small reforms. We're fighting for a revolution. And we have our own homegrown revolutionaries who are being hampered by these big six leaders. So I try to, in the book, map all of these things and hold them in tension to explain why somebody like Molly Moon begins to be an example of this institution building of the National Urban League and the philanthropic elite, which only intensifies over the course of Whitney Young's leadership over the National Urban League. And the young radicals call him Uncle Whitey, Whitey Young. All this plays out in the Black press, and Molly Moon gets attacked because even though she's not Whitney Young and disagrees with him on many things, and as I told you, she comes from a very Black radical tradition herself of organizing, anti-capitalist thought. She is seen as part of that National Urban League machine. And because she's garnering so much visibility, because of her big scale fundraiser events, even though by the time we get on the other side of the March on Washington, her fundraiser events are not bringing in the most money to the Urban League. The bulk of money, and I looked at the financial records, the bulk of the money really is coming from the Taconic Foundation, the Field Foundation, Rockefeller Brothers. It's coming from PepsiCo, General Electric, I mean, all of the major corporations, because this is part of Whitney Young's strategy. If we get where corporate America goes, the rest of the country will follow, was his thought. But she's still hosting these fundraisers, and it looks like it is like a space, a playground for the elite, Black and white. So here's Molly Moon here in a photograph. Can you recognize that woman who's standing? So Molly Moon has the big hat. Who's the woman with the pillbox hat? Yes, Josephine Baker. Josephine Baker, right? So by this point, Molly Moon's events are now being held in Midtown Manhattan. You know, she knows everybody from Josephine Baker to James Baldwin to Lorraine Hansberry to Gloria Vanderbilt. I mean, fill in the blank celebrity, they were coming to these events. The Belafontes, Shelley Winters, the actor, Marlon Brando, I mean, Ruby Dee, Ossie Davis, I mean, everybody was coming to these events. So her politics remain quite progressive, if not radical. By this point, I mean, this photograph was taken in 1961. As I told you, she was born in 1907. So by this point, she's a grandmother. No knock against grandmothers, this is not ageism here, but I'm just saying that she is a quite mature woman at this point in her activist career, but she's getting attacked by the media, by male leaders. It gets to the point where she has to sue. She launches a couple of lawsuits and is successful, but she sues because she's being attacked. As many Black women are, they are attacking her sexuality, calling her loose and lascivious, and there's a whole satirical novel that's written about her called Pink Toes, where Chester Himes, the author, uses sex as a satirical way to talk about how Black people are taking money from white elites. So her name is Molly Moon. The main character in the book's name is Mamie Mason. So this woman was so prominent at the time that everybody knew that this book was about her. So in the book, I also address the sexism within the movement. This is a photograph of, well, do you all know who this is? Dr. Brown, we know you know who this is, but Muhammad Ali at Molly Moon's Beaux-Arts ball. So again, just to say, show her reach. And also, I'll just say this, it'll be one of my last points here, but what's happening as well, so we have these different streams of money. Of course, we have this network of Black grassroots organizations who take a more horizontal mutual aid approach to fundraising, especially once they're being booted out of these community chests. We can't rely on this money. We have to raise this money on our own, and this is a long tradition of mutual aid that we can trace back to the Caribbean. So when a lot of Caribbean migrants come to the United States, there's a major wave of Caribbean migration in the early 20th century and also around World War II era. They're bringing these traditions with them as well, and these traditions of mutual aid societies and so forth. So there's that stream of money. There's also the Black church, which still to this day, most African Americans or Black Americans more broadly are giving their money to their local church. So the church is a major philanthropy. We also have this stream that's coming through the corporations and the philanthropic foundations. By this point, the Ford Foundation is in this mix. They were reluctant to join the racial equality fight in terms of how they gave their money, but by the late 1960s, early 70s, they started giving money as well. So we have that piece. And then we have Black celebrities like Muhammad Ali, where today when we think about any celebrity, singer, entertainer, artist, athlete, they all have foundations. They all have their own foundations. It's just part of what they do now for the tax break, to look generous and philanthropic and all that. But when my book starts, there is not that same formality around the Black celebrity philanthropists. And so the book looks at some of these early Black celebrities like Bill Bojangles Robinson, and then later Jackie Robinson, Muhammad Ali, Marian Anderson, and other folks who are considered philanthropists among the Black community. So I'm also looking at this thread of money, this string of money that's coming through this Black celebrity philanthropic class as well. And altogether, I look at how Black people are giving to the movement in ways that create this Black freedom economic grid. And again, this becomes my way to theorize about how money is moving, but also to help us visualize how money is being moved across the country to get it to cities and rural areas that need money during the height of the civil rights movement. So I'm going to stop there, but hopefully there are things on the table that you all can ask questions about. There will be fruitful topics for discussion. But again, I just want to lead by saying we really have to be willing to ask these questions about the money and where money for racial justice initiatives are coming from, and what are some possible solutions to these things. Is creating a fund a solution? Is creating another 501c a solution? I don't know, maybe we can talk about it. So, thank you.
We have one mic, huh? All right. I'm about to say the same thing. I have a quick question. I'm a BLM, Sean King, my Morehouse brother. And there was another gentleman, I forgot his name. I can't think of it, doesn't remind me. But again, people were critiquing Sean King. First was Black, he's white, but we saw after BLM, that there were all these reports about people like Sean and others who quote unquote profited or, made some money, after BLM. So how does that fit in narrative?
So I'll first answer this by, I'll first answer it by saying, right, I had that question in mind as well, because as I'm writing this book, of course, I see all the accusations against BLM, against Sean King, against various folks. I also saw this play out in the time period I was studying. So just on principle, I want to say that following the money becomes the biggest way that your enemies will attack you, by saying you stole, you embezzled, you misappropriated, and being able to produce some kind of paper trail. I saw this happen to Molly Moon. She was accused by this white woman who was helping her plan an event. I saw it happen to the NAACP. And so in these particular instances, the instances I know best, again, this is a strategy or a tactic to take the folks down. And in these instances, often what it is it's not outright theft or even theft, period. It's a lack of infrastructure. So when these organizations have an infrastructural problem, then it can look like money is being misappropriated because they don't have the infrastructure to take in the money. They don't have the staff to move the money. So it looks like you're hoarding resources, right? Now in this contemporary moment, so many things are still unfolding. We don't have access to the same kind of documentation that I have access to talk about some of the dynamics I see playing out in this earlier time period. What I did see happen then too in the 1950s and 60s was that became a way, saying you don't know how to handle big dollar donations became a way to discredit Black leaders. We can't give you anything because you don't know what to do with it, right? You're not a good steward over what we give to you. So some of those similar dynamics are playing out in the contemporary moment, but social media definitely amplifies all of these things because now you have folks on Twitter who have watchful eyes who are trying to figure out where is this money coming from and where is it going. I think another issue too is a lot of these organizations don't have 501c3 designations, so they can't get money from big dollar donors, or if they do, they have to have a fiscal sponsor who takes in the money, and they also get a cut off whatever money is given. And then figuring out, okay, if you are an organization, you might have 3 people who are regular staff members or something, and now you get even $5 million. What do you do with that? What kind of infrastructure do you have to even move around $5 million? So one thing BLM tried to do, which I don't think was the best move, they tried to create this BLM Global Network Fund, which in many ways mimicked the logics of big capitalism, big philanthropy. We're gonna take in all this money and then we're gonna divvy it out into grants, while a lot of their everyday members in their local chapters were starving, right? They were unhoused, they were, so the optics of it were bad. And I also think that the school of thought mirrored more of a capitalist framework of what we do with money in terms of accumulating wealth. And I think that does look shady, right? It looks like a mismanagement, a mishandling of funds. Now Sean King, he's a whole other thing. I'm not gonna say that about Brother King, but just generally speaking, it will be interesting to see 20 years down the line, when we have more access to these documents, what was actually being done with this money. And it's also important to note that there was a whole big deal made about Black Lives Matter getting $90 million, and it can even be questionable how much of that they actually got versus what they were promised. But the NAACP and the Urban League both took in way more than that. But the conversation wasn't there, in large part because they have major corporate donors who have been long-time corporate supporters, and also because a huge chunk of their money comes from the federal government as well. So BLM was already vulnerable because of the core principles of this movement and its more radical stance. They were already going to be vulnerable to these attacks around misappropriation and theft. So I think it's a messy ball of things. There's no one easy thing to say, but this research has led me to believe that it's a combination of these various elements. Anybody else have thoughts about that, by the way? Go ahead, Dr. Rice.
Yeah, I had, you said a couple of things about, where the money is two questions, where the money is coming from and where the money is going. And basically kind of your research and things like that, I want to get your thoughts on, is there such a thing as bad money? Is there such a thing as folks that don't have who partially or wholeheartedly don't have the best interests of Black folks giving money to Black folks? I think of folks like Donald Trump getting awards and giving money to Black organizations, and then those same Black organizations turning around later and saying that they wish they wouldn't have given him the award, right? Mm-hmm. But if they were to do it again, I don't know if they would reduce the money.
Right.
And so, is there such thing as bad money? Corporations that don't have the best interest of the Black community still giving money?
Yeah.
And the other part of it is there such a, what happens when the money that is given to Black organizations don't reach Black communities? Right? We can talk about giving to the NAACP and talk about giving to Black Lives Matter, things like that, but if those organizations aren't necessarily doing what they said they were going to do for Black communities, how does the community feel about that? Right?
Yeah. Yes, all great questions. So I personally believe there is a such thing as bad money. That can take different forms in terms of like what makes it bad. Sometimes it can be the funder might not be bad, but wrong initiative. Like, I personally don't think the Ford Foundation should be in the racial justice business. I think they complicate the racial justice landscape when they see themselves publicly as like, we are doing so much for Black Lives Matter. But if you need to get some funding from Ford Foundation to fund a large-scale research project, okay, maybe, right? Like, I just think that, and to me, the other part that makes it bad is that I believe that we need more than reforms in the philanthropic foundation world, just like we need more than reforms to capitalism. Now, these are just my beliefs. I do believe that with the current system, we will never see the kind of real racial justice that we want to see, the real kind of racial equality that we want to see under the current system. So I think part of what makes the money bad is that it's fruit of a poisonous tree. The whole system is flawed, right? So I don't think the money could ever be good. Another thing that makes it bad is when I'm looking and I'm saying we have raised billions of dollars to gain and protect the right to vote, we should never have to do that, right? So the kinds of fiscal responsibilities that fall on Black community and Black activists are ridiculous. Like, we shouldn't even have to fight to fund these sorts of things, right? So that's another thing that makes it bad to me. So honestly, when I would look and see these historical actors and the decisions that they were making, I'm seeing that you have Black activists making a set of decisions out of the worst possible set of choices, right? So I'm like, okay, I'm more in a Claudia Jones, Louise Thompson Patterson, Malcolm X school of thought, so I can see why they're critical of the Big Six leaders. I can also see why the Big Six leaders think, okay, but we actually do need this money. So what do we do? And how do we, if we want the legislation, what do we do? It's a terrible set of circumstances all the way around. In terms of these philanthropic foundations and other organizations, and corporations getting involved in this, we saw it in 2020. We saw all these pledges and, oh, please teach us how to be anti-racist, all these things. People wanted to seem like they were on the right side of history, right? Oh, we're gonna create all these DEI initiatives, we're gonna do all this stuff. Only just a few years later, a year later, 2 years later, kill all that stuff, right? And all of these Black people, particularly Black women who are propped up into these positions, they all lose their jobs, right? It's a major problem. In my book, I call this racial equality capitalism. The same thing was happening in the late 1940s. So before Brown v. Board, it seemed like, okay, this is a cause worth supporting, but nothing really major has happened to steer us away from these initiatives. So we can give money, and we can give it to, we'll give it to, the National Urban League's youth program, because fewer Black males out on the street causing problems, that's a good thing for everybody, right? So we'll fund those kinds of things. But we won't really do the kind of funding that will fundamentally close the racial wealth gap. So we see that same kind of racial equality capitalism logic operating today. So I do think that because of the system as it is very rare that the money actually gets to Black communities that's in need. And Alice O'Connor has this great book called Poverty Knowledge, where she talks about the poverty research complex, right? Industry. It's a whole industry of how we study poverty, but without any real intention to solve poverty. And I could see the same dynamics playing out in my book that she maps from the progressive era to the Clinton era. It's playing out today. So I'll get off my soapbox about this, but I'm very passionate about these issues because once you start following this money, you just be like, oh, this is ridiculous. And in ways that we know because we're Black studies scholars, but also in ways that you're like, wow. So now, my work might never, ever, ever be funded again, but I'm just being real about what I see in the archive. And to me, as a Black feminist historian, this is what I think my work is to do, to speak truth to power. And it was one of the reasons why I was shocked that I wanted NAACP image award, because I was calling out their leaders like, Ray Wilkins is trash. But anyway, so like, but. Any other questions?
Oh, I got a question.
Wait, bro.
Oh. Okay, so
was a cute.
yeah, he was. Let me stop. But my first question is, and it revolves around like, I know you were talking about the whole thing about, is another 501c3 going to like actually like solve the problem? So my question revolved around, I guess the amalgamation and mobilization of money. Because for me, I feel like there is an overabundance of organizations and a lack of money, right? And I feel that today, especially like with the like mass like advances that we made in technology and media and things like that, some of those gaps could honestly be filled if we were able to have, if we were able to have like more awareness about these organizations. So whether there might be like 10 organizations like in Gainesville aimed to end homelessness, because they don't have all their money going towards the same places, it's way harder to advertise and to get people who are actually involved. So my question is, what do you think would be kind of like a more effective solution as far as mobilization for the same like group of people who want to tackle the same issues? They just don't know that they're out there. How do you feel like it's best for them to connect? Do you feel like it's best to do it over a virtual space? Do you feel like is it something that kind of happens at like a big like turning point, like let's say like homelessness in Gainesville, as it has been going on for the past 1 years, this reaches such a climax that a group of people just all band together and then they have to use the momentum of one event to all mobilize? Just what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. So one of the things I saw, it was the strategy of the CUCRL. That was one of their main reasons for forming. Well, especially if you believe Malcolm X, their reasons for forming were multiple. One was that they felt like the movement was getting away from them because the people had their own agenda. They were making moves without these leaders. They wanted to be more central public figures leading the charge for the movement. They realized there's so much infighting within the organizations, in large part because we have similar agendas. We're trying to eradicate homelessness, mass poverty, housing discrimination, labor discrimination. We core believe those things, but we have different tactics and approaches to doing them. Some of them because of a 501c3 versus 501c4 designation. That's definitely part of it in there too. But it's like we're all trying to get money from the same sources. So if we consolidate our power, then we can work as a collective. We can bring in money, and then we can decide how to divvy it up across our different organizations. I can in some ways see the logic there. I think it doesn't work for very obvious reasons, most of which is because these issues are structural, as I have said them. They're structural, they're institutional. But I do think that there's a way on a local level that organizations can form coalitions, and coalition building is essential to the work that we do. And I think also key to it is creating this more horizontal, collective approach as opposed to this more hierarchical model, which the CUCRL most definitely took. A great example that I saw since UD9, I will use this as an example, you can see moments in the archive where various D9 organizations, say in Atlanta, for example, worked alongside local churches, labor unions, social groups, Molly Moon's Urban League Guild, so the local affiliate of the Urban League Guild in Atlanta, to hold voter education drives. So we're going to make sure we have the machines, the voting machines, so people can learn, how to pass these tests, and so on and so forth. So that kind of coalition building around particular issues was definitely a substantial part of how the Black Freedom Economic Grid worked. I think that there's some potential in that kind of organizing on the local level. I just think that, again, when you're up against these kind of large-scale structural issues, one of the first things that the system itself wants to do is to break those coalitions, to create infighting, to create a sense of competition around scarce resources, and so on and so forth.
This question is kind of tied. I have a lot of my students here, and so this question kind of ties to the class that we have on Black culture, Black popular culture. We've seen the movie that just came out, American Fiction, which has sort of this dilemma of how much pandering should Black folks do to secure the bag. Was there any pandering that you saw in the things that you studied, the fundraising that you studied, where folks were really just propping up Black celebrities in order to secure funds and things like that? And was there any discussion or was there any controversy within those organizations whether that should be done or not?
Ooh, yes. Look at you coming with all the good questions, Dr. Brown.
We talk about it all the time in my class.
Good, okay. And so y'all students, I want to hear from you too.
The short answer is yes. There is a lot of propping up. So the book opens in 1964 at the Rockefeller family estate in Westchester County. And it's a fancy luncheon where they brought together like 40, celebrities, Black, white, politicians, mostly white, of course, at this point. And they're all in this room, Molly Moon's in this room, and they're gathered to hear a speech from Martin Luther King. He's given, I have a dream speech. People know King. A lot of people hate him, see him as a dangerous man. A lot of, white progressives and even some racial liberals see him as, someone who they'd rather work with him than Malcolm X. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. So he's brought to this room to give this speech. He does not want to be there. King's politics are moving more toward an anti-capitalist stance, more toward a poor people's campaign. But he's there because the CUCRL has taken all this money from the Takano Foundation and the Field Foundation. And because he's the most prominent of the big six leaders, they need King to go in there and give the speech, right? So he knows that he's being propped up by the civil rights movement. He's the sacrificial lamb. He says, like, he hates supplicating these wealthy white folks, and he increasingly came to hate this. But here he is giving this speech at the Rockefeller estate. And of course, Nelson Rockefeller loves King, right? So that's one form of this propping up, right? Where you're the one who has to do the dirty work because y'all took the money. Even though this goes against your politics, and he and Whitney Young get in a certain kind of battle because King starts to move more toward this anti-capitalist stance, and even though Stokely Carmichael and other young radicals don't really see it for King like that, they definitely don't see it for Whitney Young, whose house abuts a country club, who's making a high six-figure income through the Urban League and all these other kind of things. Like they definitely don't see it for Whitney Young. So that's one form. The other form, which is really interesting, because on the one hand, it's things I found in Ebony. So earlier on, before your class ended, I showed this image that was from an Ebony magazine article. Let me see if I can pull it up here. With Molly Moon at a fundraiser with Winthrop Rockefeller, and this runs in Ebony. And Ebony is praising these white liberals the Park Avenue elite for supporting the movement. And these are people who are really putting sweat equity into the movement. They're not just tossing money down from their gilded cages. They're really invested in this movement. And so there's a propping up of the Winthrop Rockefellers of the world as well. It's like a friend to the Black community. You know, it's kind of like today if we were gonna like prop up Bezos, or you know, maybe Bezos has a more radical brother who's slightly more maverick than him, but has all the wealth and all the family name and influence. So that's what they were doing to people like Winthrop Rockefeller. But what then starts to happen, and this is probably no shocker to people, is these same white folks then who become the face of the fight for racial equality. So that they can get the speaking gigs, they can write the books, they can become the experts on race relations, right? So they can benefit from this propping up. Some might argue that it's his work with the civil rights movement that helps get Winthrop Rockefeller elected governor of Arkansas. So, because he dips out before things really get, you know, so now he can just seem like the generous philanthropist. And the third type of propping up I see is also something I found in Ebony, where the op-ed writer on this piece is saying, we don't want any more of this white money. We shouldn't be taking money from these white folks. Look at what they're doing to our HBCUs. The more involvement we give, the more they're gonna put their name on a building. Spelman College, you know, Rockefeller Hall, right? Like the more they're gonna do those things, if we give them, keep letting them in, keep letting them run the United Negro College Fund and, you know, these sorts of things. So they're like, the solution is to prop up our Black celebrities. So we have successfully raised up our own Black millionaire class. And now we have a dozen Black millionaires. So we have, you know, enough wealth, the wealth of a small nation as Black people. So we can turn to these wealthy Black folks to fund us. So in other words, Black capitalism will save us, right? So that's a different kind of propping up. Like, okay, well, you know, Joe Louis, Father Divine. They were even turning to like the underground kings, you know, like in places like New York City and Chicago. Like, look at all these, you know, former numbers runners and bankers, numbers bankers who now have all this, have amassed millions. Black farmers, Black real estate moguls. So a different kind of propping up. But then other Black leaders saying, Black capitalism won't save us either. So we can see that debate play out as well. So all sorts of propping up. Everybody was a prop.
So do you think in today's, like all the parallels we were talking about earlier with the Black Lives Matter movement, that still, I mean, it's dangerous, this conversation is fascinating because of how it seems like the groups then and the groups now are selling themselves right to the white companies, and in return the white companies get like the wokeness, like this is where we are. I don't know. We're helping out. But do you consider Molly Moon to be someone to follow in that? Like is she someone? Her steps contributed still. So that's.
Yeah, I love this question. Thank you. Yeah. Look at y'all coming with these great questions. I really appreciate it. So, one thing that I've done, and this was more anecdotal than like full-on research, but just watch the rise of the celebrity activist, and really thinking about like, what does that look like today? Like, you know, you have these activists who get, you know, high six-figure, if not seven-figure book deals. You can turn on a Beyonce song, she's shouting out activist names. These same folks have Cadillac commercials and, you know, all these other kind of things, right? So that's a certain kind of, or liquor deals, like where, you know, you're the face of Glenn Levitt or one of these How you say that? I don't know the brown liquors, but anyway. No, Glenlivet or whatever, one of those. Somebody had a Glenlivet deal. But like, and people saying that like, this is not what the movement should be doing. This is not what movement activists should be doing. So it's not just you, Dr. King, are famous/infamous. That is one thing, and that's a thing. And there was definitely debates about his charisma and the dangers of him becoming the Lord and all this stuff. But that's different than having a corporate deal, right? Like, what does it mean to be an activist who has a corporate deal? And so, literally, corporations get to trot you out as fill in the blank activist supports our brand, and we support the movement, right? I do think that there is a problem there. And so I started to think about Molly Moon, and this wasn't a thing nearly to that extent, the entanglement with corporate America in the Jim Crow era or just on the other side of it. But one thing that was interesting for me with Molly Moon was that she was oftentimes featured in Ebony magazine and like these advertorials. Like it was some Pineapple Delights or something, and it's like Molly Moon in her A-line house dress, like, this is how you should serve Pineapple Delights. You can chill them, you can slice them, you can, and so it's like her own commercial of sorts, like endorsing a brand, using her power as a socialite activist, fundraiser to endorse corporate brands. I think that people are complex. I think movements are complex. I don't think that movement activists should be broke. I don't think that committing oneself to the movement means committing oneself to a life of poverty. But I do think, going back to that question, is all money good money? Is there such thing as bad money? I mean, I do think we have to ask these questions about what does it mean to partner so explicitly with these brands, and so I think it's definitely fraught territory. And one thing I hope that this book will do is to create a blueprint for other people of your generation who will go on to study the present moment and the complexities of it. That we can kind of create a historical through line from the 1930s to the present for people who want to take on that more present day debate.
This will be our last question. Take us home.
I wanted to ask this question with the students present, but I want to make sure there's not a student who has a question since I'm taking the last question. No, we're good. Okay. So I want to ask this question with the students question. I know this is a question I could ask you with reference. We can have a conversation. But I wanted to ask you with the students question, because students present, because I think it connects the question that Timothy made. They still here? He loved him. Timothy made about coalition building, and I think it connects what Dr. Brown was asking about good money, bad money. And I think in this current moment, when I think a lot of students and young people in general are trying to figure out how to match up their values with their desire for employment or security, in this moment it's very capitalist, right? Like everybody has their own channel, their own YouTube, their own Insta company, everybody's doing their own individual thing, often with very good social justice, kind of missions, right? Often, not always, but often. Do you have any maybe advice or ideas for how, these students who are thinking about how to match up, I'm imagining that students who are here with majors that aren't related to history or African American studies are here because they're interested in how do I take these things and put them together with my desire, or maybe my parents' desire for me to have a good employment, right, post graduation. So.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for that question. You know, it's difficult. It really is difficult. I think because social media adds a whole other layer to this that wasn't even a factor when I was trying to emerge as an activist, as a thinker, as, you know, a scholar. So it really does complicate the playing field. But I think one part of this has to be, your activist work has to be soul work. So figuring out who you are and what are you actually committed to? What matters to you? Movement work is long, exhausting work. You can be a sprinter, but better to be a marathon runner. You can't do everything. You might not be able to take on every cause and make every cause your own, but what do you really care about? Like me, I care about Black women, girls, and gender expansive folks. So my work, even when the world is shifting and there's all these other issues going on, my time, my energy, my efforts, my research, my money is going to go towards supporting organizations that support the groups and people that I care about. So you gotta ask yourself, what do you truly value? Who do you truly value? Who are you? What do you have to offer to a movement? I think you have to also become students of movements. You have to read, read political thought. This is one of the reasons why I really wanted to play the Malcolm X speech, not because Malcolm X is the only voice, but because to hear Malcolm is to understand his message in a different kind of way. Become students of political thought. Read these things, have them really and truly inform your thoughts so that you're not being influenced just by, oh, if I click something on Instagram, I'm active. I'm an activist, right? Like read, really get into the books and read. And that's something that you can do on your own despite your job, right? You can read the paper, read the daily paper, even if you have all sorts of problems with it, right? It's about an awareness. The third thing I would say is, I do think that you have to find an organization to join. It's super easy to criticize all of these organizations when we're not directly involved with something. Find an organization that you care about and commit yourself to the organization. Commit yourself to understanding the leadership structure. Commit yourself to understanding the history of the organization. I am a person who believes in the power of local organizing, so I always want to have some kind of connection to a local organization. Think about ways that you can help your neighbors. I live in an ungentrified part of Harlem. I'm committed to living in a building of folks and creating our own mutual aid and support networks within our own building, right? So a lot of this doesn't have to be so grand scale, it's what kind of impact can you make in your own community? I think those are things to think about, but there are things that have to deeply be influenced by who you are and what you care about. So part of the life's work as a scholar, as an activist, as a scholar activist, as whoever you are in the world is really determining who you are and where you're going to commit your time. And that's not about a public performance per se, it's about your own self-driven in terms of like your own sense of self driven and toward the work that you want to do publicly.
Thank you very much. Let's give Dr. Ford a hand. And in fact, tomorrow night, Dr. Vanessa Willis will be talking about Claudia Jones in here at 4:30. So she mentioned Claudia Jones, a Trinidadian journalist, was in the States, got deported, so you might want to definitely come out to that. So we're on fire this week. Thank you for coming out, and have a great evening.